Hey everyone, I'm going to do something a little bit different for this video. My scheduled video is not ready and I do want to stick to an every other Tuesday release schedule for now. So I'm going to do a quick tier list of basketballreference.com stats that I use to judge players. My next video is going to be another greatest game from a top 75 player. It should be ready in a couple Tuesdays, so look forward to that. The following video I want to do is another underrated player, probably a role player who's currently in the league. I don't have anyone picked out yet, so if you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments. So let's get to the tier list. I'm going to do this from top to bottom, left to right, as you see the stats on basketballreference.com. I don't have every stat picked out, obviously, because there are dozens, maybe hundreds of them. To start out, I'm doing per game stats in the very top section of the stats page. I'm not going to do per 36 minute or per 100 possession stats because they are very similar to the per game stats in how you can use them. Obviously, those are useful in certain situations. I'm just not going to take the time to cover them in this video. First stat is minutes per game. That's going to be D tier. Basketball is broken down into games, series, seasons, individual possessions. Minutes are just kind of there. They don't mean all that much. There is some value for great players just being on the court. They attract attention even if they don't get any stats in that time. And there's some value to players who are able to stay healthy and in shape and can give the team a lot of minutes when they're shorthanded because of injuries or foul trouble or something. Other than that, I don't think minutes is all that useful. Other stats are more useful for judging players. Next is field goal percentage. That is C tier. It's a simple stat. It does what it wants to do. There are just better versions of shooting percentages, in my opinion. And we're going to get to one right now. Effective field goal percentage. A tier. This is a better version of field goal percentage since it gives different weight to 2-point and 3-point field goal attempts. The only thing I would change for this, as well as field goal percentage and true shooting percentage, which we'll get to in a minute, is I don't think it should penalize players for like heaves at the end of the clock. There are times when a player just has to force up a shot at the end of a shot clock, or even worse when someone's throwing a ball 70 feet at the end of the quarter or end of the game. And that hurts their field goal percentage stats, and that's not really fair. It doesn't matter that much for most players since those situations don't come up a lot. But like a really great player, really good shooter, is going to have the ball in his hand at the end of the shot clock a lot. He's going to be taking a lot of low percentage shots. Those aren't bad shots. I don't think he should be penalized for the team's offense breaking down. So if I were to make one change to field goal percentage stats, it would be basically anything outside of 30 to 35 feet at the end of a clock. Don't count it as a shot unless it goes in, kind of like they do with shooting fouls, where if you miss a shot when you get fouled, it doesn't count against your shooting percentage. I would do that for heaves at the end of the clock, but it's not a real big weakness to that stat, so I think A tier is fine for it. Free throw percentage, also C tier. In my opinion, made free throws and free throw attempts are both more valuable than free throw percentage. The value to percentage is like technical shots after technical fouls, or at the end of the game when you're trying to ice a victory and you need to make free throws. That's when having a guy with a really great free throw percentage is valuable. Otherwise, I think just getting to the line, just making shots, even if your percentage isn't all that high, is more valuable than shooting like 4 free throws per game and shooting 90% on those. Rebounds per game is next. I'm calling that B tier. It's a very simple stat. You grab a missed shot, you get a rebound. Um, the reason it's not higher is if you look in recent years at the rebounds per game leader, a lot of those players aren't Hall of Famers at all. Some of them have never even been to an All-Star game in their career. So I do question how useful rebounds per game is to judging a player's value, at least in the current era. When you look further back in the league, the rebounds per game leaders are almost always Hall of Famers. But in recent years, it's been like Clint Capella, Hassan Whiteside won it one year. He's definitely not a Hall of Famer. DeAndre Jordan. I'll put a list of the rebounds per game leaders on this video in post, so you can look at that. I think maybe in particular, since these are stats that I use, I should be looking at offensive rebounds per game and defensive rebounds per game separately from rebounds per game. I think that's a little bit more valuable. A really great offensive rebounder is absolutely going to help his team out a lot. Because grabbing offensive rebounds is almost like forcing a turnover in a lot of situations. Next, assists per game. Might be a surprise. I'm going D tier on assists per game. I think it's a decent way to judge players' values. There's just so many flaws to the stats. Assists are so subjective. Different statisticians are going to call different plays assists from each other. If you look at the top assists per game seasons of all time, 17 of the top 18 of them came between 1984 and 1995. And I think that's pretty solid proof that this is subjective. By the way, bonus points if you could name the 18th guy. The one guy in the top 18 who didn't play between 1984 and 1995. I don't think you will get it unless you already know who it is. Some of the things I would like to change about assists per game. If you make a pass that leads to a shooting foul and the player makes free throws, you don't get an assist for that. I would like to see the player get an assist for that. I know in soccer, if you make a pass to a player who draws a penalty and then makes a penalty kick, the passer gets an assist for that. So I don't know why we can't do that for basketball. The other thing is hockey assists. The final two passers before the goal both get credit for an assist. I don't know that I would necessarily give out hockey assists in basketball. I just think that's just one weakness to assists. Like the player who makes the first pass is the one creating the shot, even if he isn't the one making the final pass, you know. And then one other thing I don't like about it, this is very personal for me. I was an assistant coach on a high school team for a few years, and I kept stats for the team. We had one player who would absolutely chase assists. Like he would ask me how many assists he had, how many more he needed to get to 10 in that game. He never did it in close games, so it wasn't really a problem for the team, but it still got very irritating. And I know professional players have done this as well. Wilt Chamberlain supposedly did this. He would go and ask the statistician whether he got credit for an assist at times during timeouts in games. Like Russell Westbrook, I don't know if he would talk to statisticians or anything, but he would absolutely pass up wide open shots to try to pad his assist totals. I don't feel like assists per game always captures how good a passer the player really is, or how valuable a passer the player really is. You also get a lot of cheap assists. Like you can just be dribbling at the top of the key, pass over to the wing who takes a jump shot and makes it. You get an assist for that, even though you didn't really do anything. Versus having the ball in the post, making a skip pass all the way out to the opposite corner to a player who makes another pass to someone on the wing who's now wide open. The guy in the post who made the first pass is the one who created the shot. He doesn't get any stat for that. So I could keep going. I could keep complaining about assists. But that's why it's D tier. All right, up next is steals per game. That's going to be B tier. Steals are extremely important. Any forced turnover is a huge play, and that's why this is B tier and not A or S tier, because a lot of forced turnovers aren't counted as steals. If a defender knocks a ball out off an offensive player, that's not a steal. If he gets in position to force a travel, force a carry, not a steal. Takes a charge, not a steal. All these are huge plays, don't really get any stat, at least not any stat that commonly gets looked at by fans. Other than that, steals, great stat. B tier is pretty fine for it. Blocks per game, kind of similar, kind of the opposite of steals in that every time you deflect a shot, it gets counted as a block, but not all blocks are huge plays. Sometimes you block the ball and it goes right back to the offense, who scores immediately. That's my only complaint about blocks. Otherwise, I think it's a great stat. I think maybe if altered shots were counted somehow as blocks or as some other stat that fans could easily see, then that would be maybe a little bit better. But B tier is fine for it. Turnovers per game, C tier. Turnovers matter, but the types of turnovers and the situation that the turnovers are committed in matter more. Giving the ball away to a defender to start a fast break and get 2 points the other way, those are terrible turnovers. But the types of turnovers where you're trying to make a play, and where if you're not able to make the play, it's a dead ball and you're able to get back and set your defense, those aren't always that bad. Like throwing a risky pass where either your teammate's going to catch it and get 2 points or the ball's going to go out of bounds, that doesn't hurt your team that much if you turn it over. Being aggressive, attacking the basket, having a defender slide in and take a charge, those turnovers, that's just the defender making a play. I don't want to fault the offensive player that much. So turnovers don't really matter to me when I see a player with a huge turnover stat. There are some stats that count the type of turnover, but even that, it's not really easy to judge whether the turnovers are leading to points the other way or not. I would love to see a stat that does do that. That would be my ideal stat. I would just immediately take that and replace turnovers per game with it. Now, points per game, going to be A tier. You got to score points to win. Everything else you do on the court's optional. Every player in the history of the NBA who led the league in points per game is in the Hall of Fame or will be a first ballot Hall of Famer. You occasionally get players who get empty points on bad shooting for bad teams. A fairly recent player comes to mind is like Monte Ellis. I think had about 25 points per game once or twice without really being a good player, but I don't think anyone considers him a great player. It's pretty easy to tell when someone's just scoring a lot of points for bad teams. Points per game, great way to judge players. Okay. I don't have it on here, but in the per 100 possessions area of the basketball reference stats are offensive rating and defensive rating. I forgot to put it on here because I just skipped over the per 100 possessions section. But I do look at offensive rating and defensive rating when I'm looking at a player. Offensive is estimate of points contributed per 100 possessions, and defensive is estimate of points allowed per 100 possessions. These stats are really complicated if you look up the formulas. And since I didn't add them to the list ahead of time, I didn't give myself a chance to try to understand them better. They seem to do a pretty good job for most players of showing their value. The one exception I've noticed is centers who take all their shots near the basket and grab a lot of rebounds and blocks seem to get overrated. I probably would have put this somewhere in B tier, C tier, if I'd thought about it ahead of time. Now we go on to the advanced stats section. First is PER, which I'm going to call C tier, probably put it at the top of C tier. This is based on John Hollinger's PER with a few tweaks for other eras and seasons that Hollinger didn't calculate. This is basically counting stats on a per minute basis and adjusting for league averages. It seems to weight shooting percentages pretty high, which I don't think makes a lot of sense for a per minute stat. For example, last season, Montrezl Harrell was the number 12 player in PER. He played about 20 minutes per game, had a really high shooting percentage, pretty good rebounding numbers, but definitely not a top 12 player. Of all the popular advanced stats, this is personally my least favorite. It does an okay job of judging players from early eras of the NBA, though, better than some other advanced stats do. Now, true shooting percentage is A tier. Going to the top of A tier, it's the best shooting efficiency, or the best scoring efficiency stat. This tries to estimate the points scored per possession used to try to score, if that makes sense. It just factors in 2-point percentage, 3-point percentage, and free throw percentage, unlike EFG, which just uses 2-point and 3-point percentage. And now all of these percentage stats: total rebounding percentage, assist percentage, steal percentage, block percentage, and turnover percentage. These are all actually different from each other, very slight and subtle ways. Total rebounds is the estimated percentage of all available rebounds that are grabbed by this player. Assists are an estimate of the teammates' makes that were assisted by this player. Steals is an estimate of steals. Steals is an estimate of opponents' possessions that result in a steal by this player. Block is an estimate of opponents' 2-point shot attempts that are blocked by this player. Doesn't take 3-point attempts into account. And then turnovers is an estimate of turnovers committed per 100 possessions. I'm going to put these in C tier, probably above turnovers per game. I don't use them all that much. I don't think they're that much useful than like just regular rebounds per game and everything. But they are good for comparing two players from different eras. Like in the past, when games were played at a much higher, much slower pace, the percentage stats can be better than per game stats. Although you can really just look at per 100 possession or per 36 minute stats, they do the same thing. Usage percentage, similar to those, but a little bit different. It's an estimate of plays used by the player. Plays means taking a shot, getting to the free throw line, or committing a turnover. And this is percentage of offensive possessions that the player does one of those three things. I'm going to call it B tier. I'll put it at the end of B tier. It does an okay job of estimating like how much of the offense runs through the player, though obviously there are ways you can contribute on offense that are counted by this, like setting a great screen can free open a player for a layup. Again, hockey assists don't get counted by it. Just making a good cut can free up space to get a teammate a shot. None of those get counted in usage percentage, but otherwise I think it does an okay job of estimating how much an offense runs through that player. You really need to use that stat along with other stats. Like a player with a high usage percentage whose stats aren't that great compared to a player with a lower usage percentage. probably isn't going to be as good as the player who puts up better numbers while using fewer possessions. But you can judge like the importance of a player to his team with this. Now win shares is B tier, gonna put it at the top of B tier. This is the advanced stat that factors in team stats. I like it a lot because NBA basketball is a team sport, and win shares is going to make a great role player look better than any of these other stats do. It'll make a 30-point per game player on a great team look better than a 30-point per game player on a bad team. The only problem is it maybe gives too much weight to team success. Like if you compare the win shares from a really good team to the win shares on a bad team, you'll often see the 7th, 8th, even 9th best player on a good team will have more win shares than the best player on a bad team. I don't know that that makes sense. It also isn't as useful for early eras because the defensive win shares is really a lot of guesswork. And then a great player on a balanced team is going to have a lower win shares than a great player with mediocre teammates. For example, if you look at Stephen Curry in his prime and compare him to Chris Paul in his prime, Curry had better teammates than Chris Paul did. Even though I think they're similar players to each other, Chris Paul is going to have higher win shares most season just because his teammates are taking fewer win shares away from him. And win shares per 48 minute is going to be higher than win shares. Not a lot higher, but I think it does a little bit better job than win shares because it doesn't penalize a player for missing games due to injuries or suspensions or whatever, just rest days. This does a better job of judging a player's value to his team over an entire season, whereas this does a better job of judging a player's value to his team when he's on the court. I think this is just a better way of judging his overall value. BPM. This is going to be C tier. I'll put it right behind PER. I talked about this in my Trae Young video. BPM is admittedly by the creator bad at defense, which is why I like win shares, because team success seems like a better way to judge how good players actually are on defense than stats like defensive rebounding and steals. Rarely does one player dominate a game defensively like they can on offense, so team success is just better than the stats. This stat gives stats different weights based on the player based on the position that the player plays, and shooting percentages are given different weights depending on the role that the player has on the offense. It's kind of weird. If you like stats, you should definitely look this up and read about it. I kind of like that shooting percentages are given different weight because of what I talked about in the field goal percentage comments, where certain players have to force up bad shots that hurt their percentages, so their field goal percentage doesn't drag their BPM down as much as someone who's only taking wide open shots. But I'm not as big a fan of how their other stats are weighted based on position. In basketball, positions are very fluid sometimes. Players will play all over their court. They'll play different positions in the same game. So I don't know how you can force players into one positional box like that and have the stat make sense. And it's called box plus minus. It's not actually the plus minus of the player. Plus minus is how much the team outscores or is outscored by the other team while that player is on the court. Box plus minus is meant to be an estimate of that, I believe, but it isn't actually measuring that. I have seen some people get that confused. VORP. VORP is the version of BPM that factors in how much the player plays. So I'm going to stick it right by BPM because it goes hand in hand with BPM. I don't think I've ever seen a player whose VORP and BPM differed enough that it really caught my attention and confused me. But I'm going to give it its own spot on the tier list because I do see people talk about it separately from BPM sometimes. I think it's because the names get taken too literally. Again, they hear box plus minus, think it's measuring plus minus. They see value over replacement player and think it's measuring value. I mean, it is trying to measure the value over replacement player, but it's not doing anything different than BPM is, really. Okay, now we're on to the adjusted shooting section of the stat sheet. Field goals added and total shooting added. These are going straight to S tier. I love these stats. They are the two best shooting stats, and you can tell from where I have other shooting stats ranked that I do like shooting percentage stats in general. FG add is a comparison of a player's shooting percentage to the league shooting percentage that season or over his entire career. And then it looks at the player's 2-point and 3-point attempts to determine how many points the player scored over or under an average shooter. TS add does the same thing but with true shooting percentage, so it factors in free throw percentage and free throw attempts as well. In my opinion, these are the best way to compare shooting percentages in different eras, and they're often a good way to compare high usage versus low usage / high percentage shooters. Shooters who get assisted on all their shots will have a higher score here than they should, but otherwise it feels pretty much perfect. For example, Joel Embiid added 169 points from true shooting in 68 games last season, for an average of 2.5 points per game over an average shooting player who otherwise has Embiid's exact same abilities. 76ers for the season were 2.6 points per game over their opponents, so Embiid, just from shooting ability, turned his team from a completely average one to the number 4 team in the East. I think this is a great way to judge the offensive ability of any player in any era. I don't see anyone else ever looking at these. Maybe there's something I'm missing. Maybe they're not as good as I think. But I think fans and anyone judging NBA players should be looking at these stats a lot more than they do. Okay. On to another section of the basketball reference stat sheet, but I forgot to write down what the name of it was. This stat is plus minus per 100 possessions. This one is doing what people think BPM is doing. This is actually measuring how many points the player's team scores compared to the opponent's team per 100 possessions that the player's on the court. I can't find any information about whether this is actually measuring the plus minus or whether it's an estimate. NBA.com stats also has a plus minus, and their numbers are different than Basketball Reference's numbers. So at least one of them has to be an estimate. Maybe both are. I don't know. Until I figure that out, I can't recommend this stat. I can't put it any higher than D tier. It seems like it would be really useful, like this could be A or S tier if I figure out how to use it, but for now it's D tier. I think it's a pretty new addition to Basketball Reference's stats. I haven't noticed it before very recently, just in the last few months really. So I'm going to keep looking into this. Maybe I'll figure it out and have more to say on it. Maybe I'll figure out NBA.com stats, and when I do a tier list for their stat categories, maybe I'll put it a lot higher. I don't know. If you have more information on this stat you can give me, please put that in the comments. I would love to know. And the final stat is game score. I'm going to call it C tier. I'm going to put at the end of C tier. This is just counting stats, but it's a simple, easy way to find a player's best statistical performances. I did not have any F tier stats, which makes sense. It was kind of dumb that I put F tier on here since I only picked stats that I actually use when I'm judging players. If I had To pick a stat from Basketball Reference to call F tier, I'd maybe be triple doubles. It's like a much, much worse version of game score, just a way of looking to see whether a player had a good game. Um, there's not um, there's not a lot of bad stats on Basketball Reference, just a lot of repetitive ones. Again, all of these, you can find these in the per 36 minute and per 100 possession stats as well. When you really want to get into the nitty gritty of comparing players, you can look into those. Just in my opinion, you can get a good comparison for players and a good ranking of players from these stats right here. Any per 36 minute per 100 possession. Of course, there are playoff versions of all these stats too. Those are all useful for judging players. They're just too similar to all these to get their own spot on my list. So here's my list. If you want to make your own, go ahead, send me a link. I'd love to see it. I'd love to hear any comments if you think some of these I have ranked low are better than how I'm judging them, or if I'm overrating some of these stats at the top. Again, in a couple weeks, I'll have another video on a great player's greatest game. And after that, hopefully an underrated player. Next time I don't have a video ready for my scheduled release, I will probably do a tier list of NBA.com stat categories. There are quite a few very different ones between the two sites, NBA.com and BasketballReference.com. So I hope you stick around to see that tier list as well. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.